Hello and welcome to Introduction to Brain Injury. My name is Carly Endries. I am the Senior Project Coordinator for the North Dakota Brain Injury Network. And we created these three courses: Introduction to Brain Injury, Cognitive and Behavioral Consequences of Brain Injury, and kind of a now what, or my client has a brain injury, now what, for you res hab and service providers in brain injury in North Dakota. So we hope you enjoy. This is the first of three courses. We have three staff members at NDBIN, North Dakota Brain Injury Network. Rebecca Quinn is our director. She can be found at that information there. Nikki Livdalen is our resource facilitator, so she answers that 855 number if you were to call that. And then I am the senior project coordinator in charge of kind of a lot of our education and training aspects of things. So we are going to dive right in today because we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So basically, we're going to start with a brief overview of brain injury, just kind of give you some info on what it means to have brain injury or how do we get one. So ABI is the umbrella term, and that is acquired brain injury. So that is any damage to the brain occurring after birth and prior to degenerative dementias. We get a lot of questions about like Alzheimer's. Does Alzheimer's mean you have a brain injury? And no, it does not. So Alzheimer's is degenerative in nature, meaning it gets worse and worse. With brain injury, it is a chronic condition. So it is something that the individual will struggle with on and off throughout their life, but it's not necessarily going to get better or worse. There are two types of brain injuries. There are traumatic brain injuries, or TBI. So those are from an external force, things that happen outside of the body that come into contact with the body and cause damage. And we also have internal or acquired brain injuries, things that are kind of happening inside the body, or related internally. So oxygen deprivation, near drownings, strangulations, those things like that. Infectious diseases such as COVID, chemical or substance exposure or overdose. We are seeing a lot of brain injury from overdose with the opioid pandemic happening here in North Dakota. And then strokes and tumors also constitute brain injury. So North Dakota just changed our definition in 2019 to allow strokes and tumors and ABIs to be considered under the formal definition of brain injury. So the leading causes nationwide of brain injury are falls. Here in North Dakota, particularly slipping and falling on ice. So we always remind people to be very careful on the ice. We want to wear the spikes on the bottom of our shoes and salt our sidewalks and keep our sidewalks clear of ice and snow in the wintertime. But falls predominantly are made up of two age groups, ages 0 to 4, and then ages 75 plus have a lot of falls. And so those kind of areas make up the majority of brain injuries that we see nationwide, and this is for TBI. So this is kind of the estimated 2 million brain injuries occur in the US annually. 50,000 of those lead to deaths, 282,000 to hospitalizations, and then many people go to the ER, but then many people also don't go to the ER. So we have kind of we're a best guess as far as when we say how many TBIs occur in the US annually because of that not going in for care. Many people may not go in due to lack of insurance. They may not go into because of the way they sustain their injury. It might be from domestic violence, so they're afraid of reporting and maybe losing children, things like that. Sometimes they got their injury from, a time when they were using substances such as drugs or alcohol. And so they maybe don't remember the events, or maybe didn't think they were serious enough to go in to get checked out. But brain injury is extremely prevalent. It makes up, more than a lot of other disability areas. It also makes up more, than breast cancer, spinal cord injuries, HIV and AIDS. So very, very prevalent. A lot of people You know, it's the second most prevalent disability in the United States. 4.5% of our population are living with a brain injury, or about 10% of general population is living with a brain injury. There are several populations within brain injury that have high risk, or they have in proportionate numbers of people with brain injuries. And so, like I said in our last slide, 10% of the general population has a brain injury. But if we look at just the criminal justice population, studies are showing that people incarcerated and involved in that system are showing as high as a 60 to 87% history of brain injury. Minnesota did a study a few years back, and their males were coming out at 82%, their females at 90%, and their juveniles at 99%. So significant number of people involved in the criminal justice system, and this is all before. So their injury was before their involvement with the criminal justice system. A lot of times we like to sort of point to the symptomology of brain injury as to why this population ends up involved in the criminal justice system. So when we move along further in my slides, we'll talk more about that and how that symptomology can kind of lead to this chronic cycle of failure. Suicide risk. Individuals with brain injury are very likely to commit suicide, and so we need to be aware of that and know that that is a risk factor for those injuries. And even years after their injury, they're still possibly going to struggle with this. One of the things about brain injury is they don't go through kind of your typical suicidal ideation type steps. They often jump to the final act due to, you know, again, some of that symptomology with brain injury that we'll talk about in a little bit, but impulsivity being one of those. So we have been talking a lot when we present about gun safety and keeping guns locked, keeping guns in safe places, making sure that we have that open communication and talking with people and making sure they know of their support systems in place so that they can utilize those should they need to. Homelessness is another area of concern or high risk. About 45% of homeless men have a history of brain injury, but 87% of those had that brain injury prior to losing their home. So again, kind of like the incarcerated individuals as well, or those individuals in the criminal justice system. So telling us basically if we provide intervention earlier and better intervention, hopefully we can help prevent that risk of like I said, the cycle of failure. And then substance abuse. So a lot of people end up having kind of a co-occurring disorder. So they'll have a co-occurring substance abuse problem as well as a brain injury. And a lot of people actually develop a substance use problem after their initial brain injury. So it's important that we warn people about that risk when they do end up with a brain injury, and that we talk about it, you know, that they should probably avoid substances or really limit their substance use should they choose to partake in behavior like that, because their chance of becoming addicted and it becoming a problem is much higher than the general population without brain injury. Domestic violence is also a high-risk population. Many women go to the emergency room, but not as many as we would like. The way that we gauge brain injury is based on loss of consciousness. So when we look at like this study, 167 women reporting to the ER for injuries associated with domestic violence, 30% of those experienced loss of consciousness on at least one occasion. And then 67% had problems related to brain injury from after that violence took place in their home. So if there was violence in the home, that individual as well as their children should probably be screened for brain injury, which we will talk about in a couple slides as well. So pediatric brain injury, when we look at brain injury, pediatric brain injury is the leading cause of death and disability for children and teens. So I talked earlier about that 0 to 4 age group being susceptible to falls. So that is one of the reasons why they fall into that category. But then there's also the age group of 15 to 19, which we're learning how to drive, we're learning how to play a lot of different sports and activities and things like that. And so much higher risk for children and teens. Early intervention with this group is necessary, highly necessary. Oftentimes older injuries get forgotten about, and we need to make sure that kids, especially once their executive functioning skills get higher. So typically, excuse me, about the middle school age group is when we start to see that gap between their peers really get more prevalent, basically. A lot of people, it's a misconception that, an older injury, they'll just grow into it or it'll be fine. But actually time reveals rather than heals. And the brain oftentimes does a great job of compensating for itself for several years after injury. But then once those skills get harder and we have to, do things like planning and judgment and reasoning and those higher level thinking skills, then the brain starts to not be able to kind of manage all of that stuff. So that's when supports are often needed, is after that time. There's a study that showed that only 2% of brain injuries are referred for special education, when 18% should be. So something to think about if you're working with a child with a brain injury, about that referral process and about what special education could look like for that student and how it would benefit them. Part of my job is going into the classroom, so that is another thing that NDBIN does offer is classroom supports for teachers and students with brain injury. So just let us know, shoot us an email if you have people that fit this category. All right, so I talked a little bit about our severity continuum before, but I just want to give you a visual of it. So with brain injury, with TBIs especially, traumatic brain injury, there's a severity continuum. So basically, the longer you are unconscious, so LOC stands for loss of consciousness, the longer you are unconscious, the more likely you have long-term impairments. So the good thing is, though, that most brain injuries that we see nationwide are mild. So loss of consciousness less than 30 minutes. And this is kind of subjective as well, because not everyone loses consciousness with a mild brain injury. A mild brain injury can also be considered a concussion. And so if you've ever had a concussion, many people have, we don't always lose consciousness or get knocked out, so to speak. We might just feel kind of dazed and confused and sick, and not necessarily lose consciousness. So not everyone goes in for those, or really even sees it as a brain injury. Moderate brain injuries are when we are unconscious for 30 minutes to 24 hours, and 30 to 50% of that population or that group have long-term impairments. And then 5 to 10% have severe brain injury or a coma. So we go into a coma, we have loss of consciousness greater than 24 hours, but 80% of those individuals often have long-term impairments. So after loss of consciousness, and we end up maybe in the emergency room in the hospital, as we start to wake up and start to respond to things, there are some scales that the doctors will use to gauge this. And so one of those scales is the Glasgow Coma Scale, or GCS. And so they have some different rating scales that they will give, related to eye opening, related to motor response, and related to verbal response. And those are given different numbers and different scales. I don't think for you in the home setting that this is as critical to know, but just to understand that there are numbers assigned to how people kind of come out of coma and wake up after brain injury. You might notice this on people's paperwork that you see if you're reading about, the history of a new client or something. You might see, they were given a GCS score of 5. So this is just kind of a page to put this on your radar. I wouldn't worry too much. You're not going to be tested on any of this information, but it's just something to know about. And if you're kind of like me and you like those more clinical type shows like a Grey's Anatomy, you'll hear GCS. They came in with a GCS of, they'll give a number. So just kind of give you some information on what that means. There is also another scale that we'll use. This one is a Rancho Amigos scale, similar to the GCS, but it goes further out, in my opinion. So it goes from level 1 all the way up to my Roman numerals up to 8 there. And so lots of different levels, lots of different things that are happening. And this can be a scary time for the caregiver of that individual. So a lot of times when people wake up and they, are reorientating to the world after a brain injury, they can be very confused and very agitated. Like I said, that's scary for the caregivers of that individual and the family members, but to the doctors, it's a good thing because it shows that your brain is functioning and it's working. It's just trying to reorient itself, but it can be scary for people involved, and sometimes people can be kind of almost stuck at a certain level for multiple a long period of time and need help within their therapies and whatnot to kind of move throughout the levels and get to be more purposeful and appropriate with their actions and their behaviors. So brain injury, again with TBI, there's different kinds of injuries that we might experience and different reasons why our brain is performing the way it is now. And so you might see this again on like the history of injuries when looking at clients' paperwork. But one of the types of injuries is a coup contra coup injury. So that's under the site of impact with an object, and a contra coup injury occurs on the side opposite that the area was hit. So basically, our brain, there's the brain, there's the skull, and there's some fluid in between there. So the brain can shift around inside of our skull, especially when there's, impact. So this is just basically saying that, let's say our head hit, the steering wheel of the car in a motor vehicle accident, but then the brain can also hit the back of our head too, causing injury to 2 spots, when actually the spot that was hit was, maybe at the front of our head, but then the back of our head might have injury too, or vice versa. So basically just saying that the brain can shift around and cause injury to different parts of the brain, even the area that wasn't necessarily hit from the force. We have diffuse axonal injuries, and that's when there's the movement within the brain itself. It's stretching and snapping and shearing of axons. Axons are the fancy cells inside of our brain that talk to one another and basically make everything happen inside of our brain and inside of our body. And so if you see a diffuse axonal injury, it's basically it went back and forth, but as well as up and down and just kind of all over, and just really sheared those axons. And so we have a lot more connections to make. Abdurable hematoma is when a blood clot forms on top of the dura mater. So there is different layers of the brain. Again, you won't be tested on this, and we don't expect you to know all of the details, but just to know the basics and to kind of understand what you're reading when you might be reading about a client. But epidural hematoma is basically a blood clot on the top of the brain. Okay. And then we have a subdural hematoma, which is a blood clot, which is under the dura mater. So the dura is kind of one of those layers of the brain. And so there's, one that's under and one that's over. We at the Brain Injury Network have a saying. We like to say, if you've met one person with a brain injury, you've met one person with a brain injury. And so just like all of us are unique, and we, have our own personalities and our own, strengths and weaknesses and all of that, individuals with brain injury do as well. And brain injuries vary a lot. Well, we saw the mild, moderate, severe, so that is one way they vary, but there's also, depending on the nature of the injury. So was it a coup, contra coup? Was it a diffuse axonal? Was it a stroke? Was it a strangulation? All of those things are going to make a difference. How the injury occurred, and how long did it take medical care to get there? Did we go in for medical care at all? So there's a lot of different things that happen with brain injury. And so everyone is so different. If you've met one person with a brain injury, you've met one person with a brain injury. Okay. So just like snowflakes, they're all very unique, very different. So the information we're giving you today is generalizations of brain injury, and may not be true for everybody, or may not be consistent throughout everybody. So brain functionality is complex. The brain is a very complicated organ with millions of cells and connections. Okay. Specific areas of the brain might be related to specific functions, but they all rely on each other. So it involves many areas interacting and communicating together. So a lot of times we will get people that, get really hung up on, well, my injury was this kind, maybe like a frontal lobe or something like that. And so we'll look at what the frontal lobe is responsible for, and that should be how we figure out what to do with this individual. Well, we wish it were that simple. It's not that simple. The brain relies so much and is so interconnected, all the lobes and the axons, and everybody's trying to talk to each other. And so when there's damage, it can be really hard to pinpoint, and it's not going to just rely on that one area because of, again, the brain moves around and things like that happen. This is Ben Carson, and I think this is a great example of how complicated the brain is. So I'm just going to play this for you. It's about 1 minute.
How many people here remember your birthday? Okay, I think it's unanimous. What did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory media, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the over and round window, set up a vibratory force in the inner lip, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which travel across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, sitting bilaterally at the brainstem to the lamella meniscus to the inferior colliculus, and the median geniculate nuclei across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes begin auditory process. From there to the frontal lobes, coming down the track of pictures, you're retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampus circulating memory bodies back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bed cell level. Coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decusation, into the spinal growth gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle. So you can raise your hand. And that's the simplified version of what your brain has to see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But but if your brain can do that and you barely even had to think about it, what is your brain capable of if you actually put your mind to something?
Okay, so that's a very complicated example, but it's true. That's how many things that our brain needs to do in order to raise your hand. So when you think about all those steps that go on that we aren't even aware of, the brain is just very, very complicated, and it definitely relies on a lot of other things to work correctly. So this is kind of a very simplified brain functioning chart. So there are 4 main areas of the brain, 4 main lobes of the brain. The frontal lobe is our executive functionings. So our thinking, our planning, our organizing, problem solving, emotional behavioral control, our personality, our social skills, all that stuff's in our frontal lobe. And that's what develops last. So we develop from the back of the skull forward as we're born and as we grow and age and all that. So the frontal lobe up here is kind of one of those last ones to finish developing. Typically for females, it's about 25, and males, it's about 26 years of age. So we think back to all those great decisions we made in college in our early 20s. A lot of that is because our frontal lobes really weren't developed yet, right? So that was sarcasm there. But another lobe of our brain is parietal lobe. That is where our perception, our making sense of the world, our arithmetic, spatial judgment, our sensations are in there. So I always tell students, you know, it's kind of where our brain tells us, oh, I gotta go to the bathroom. Very important part of the brain there on the kind of the top part. The occipital lobe is at the very back of the skull. That's where our visual processing, our recognition of size, color, light, dimensions, so depth perception, all of those kinds of things are controlled by our occipital lobe. And I come back to cerebellum, but the temporal lobe is kind of underneath. That's where our memory, our auditory processing, language, so it's understanding language, and it's also producing language go into that temporal lobe, kind of tucked in underneath. And then the cerebellum is what connects us to the spinal cord. So that is kind of what controls our balance and our coordination and all of that good stuff that we obviously need. So again, these are all, this is very simplified, and it is a very complicated process, and these really all rely on one another and work together to make us who we are. So when we have injury to these areas, there can be some effects, obviously. So when we look at just the frontal lobe, so that's that front part, we have executive functioning issues. We can be very distractible. We have social problems. Our short-term memory often suffers from frontal lobe dysfunction or an impact to the frontal lobe. Impulsivity, poor decision making, and confabulation. Confabulation is basically when our brain sort of fills in the story for us. So individuals with brain injury, you know, they might know they have a brain injury, they might know some details, but maybe you ask them, like, how did you get your brain injury? And they might say, oh, I got hit in the head with a baseball at a baseball game, but actually they had a fall at church or something like that. So they're telling you a story about how they got hurt. And they're not necessarily lying, but they're not really telling the truth either. The brain is so amazing that it just kind of fills in those gaps with experiences that they might have had, or might have thought about or dreamt about, you know, somewhere in their brain that experience happened to them, but it might not be exactly the experience that is true. So we have to be careful with brain injury with like self-report too. We want to make sure we involve the entire family because and caregivers or people that were involved in reading reports, because they might not get the complete story, and it's really not a lie, but it's not really the truth either. All right, the parietal lobe, so that one on the top there, that if that is disrupted or has injury to it, we can have difficulty with sensations and touch or temperature or pain. We might get some unusual skin sensations and oftentimes imbalance also from injury to that part of the brain. The temporal lobe is going to help, or not going to help, is going to hurt our remembering, our difficulty pulling things out of our memory, basically, difficulty comprehending things that people might be saying, as well as difficulty speaking. When we have things like aphasia, like that verbal aphasia, when we just can't find those words, oftentimes the temporal lobe that was affected by that. And we have the occipital lobe, that's, remember, again, at the very back of the head. So oftentimes we have visual field loss, or some people will have double vision or field cuts, a lot of things with vision. When I say field cuts, it's honestly like black, like they'll see, you know, certain things, but then they might see a line of black, and then they might see the other half of the thing where stuff is just missing from their vision. Depth perception can be very hard, so you want to be careful with steps. Putting like a bright colored rug at the bottom of your steps can be really helpful for people with that issue. And like parking their vehicle can be very hard. And then unreliable visual information. So just what they're seeing might not be completely accurate as to what is actually there. So again, that cerebellum, that's what coordinates all of our movement and controls the direction, speed, and integration of movement. Okay. So you might see sometimes that people have damage to the cerebellum, or maybe the cerebellum. I had one individual I worked with that their cerebellum had to be kind of moved within the brain, and so they struggle with you know, steps sometimes, or just their balance, and especially with their big groups of people. They prefer to kind of, wait or go at a later time, or, not when things in stores are so busy and stuff like that, where there's a lot of people that could bump into you, things like that. The cerebellum, or the brainstem, excuse me, has quite a bit of importance because it's our central point for incoming and outgoing information and basic life function. Okay, so our brainstem connects the cerebrum and the cerebellum, so it kind of connects everything together down to the spinal cord. Very important part of all of this stuff. All right, so just a quick review. There are how many lobes of the brain? Give you a second to think about that. If you said 4, there are 4. Good. What is the leading cause of brain injury? Is it domestic violence or is it falls? If you said falls, you are correct. So falls would be the leading cause of brain injury. Again, we have that 0 to 4 age group, and we have that 75 plus age group that are both very susceptible to falls and kind of make up that large proportion of brain injuries. The brain is very complicated with thousands or millions of cells and connections. Millions, right? So let me think back to that video and all those steps and all those connections that had to be made, and it actually probably is closer to billions, but definitely for sure millions. All right, so now that you know about brain injury, let's talk about how it affects us and it impacts us. So the limbic system, the function, if we have injury to that limbic system, we can have rapid changes in emotions. Again, mixed emotions. So things like laughing while we're sad, crying when we're laughing, or crying when we should be laughing and laughing when we should be crying, right? That can be really embarrassing for clients, but it does happen. It's very true, and they really they can tell something's off by the way people are responding to them, but they don't really even know why. They can become angry and fearful very quickly. A lot of anxiety. Having brain injury itself is almost anxiety producing, just because oftentimes there's a before and after where I knew myself before my injury, and now I don't quite know myself as well as I thought I did, or my body just isn't working the way that it did before, and so that can create a lot of anxiety as well. The recovery after brain injury. So there is no cure for brain injury, unfortunately, but we do see a rapid recovery in the first 6 months. And typically that is more along the lines of physical stuff going on. If our gait got off from the injury, things like that, that usually kind of is able to bounce back pretty quickly. But again, brain injury is more similar to a chronic condition. It has changing needs and inconsistent needs as well, which can make it a frustrating population to work with. But to me, they're fun too, because they always are keeping you on your toes, right? And there's new things happening every day. So again, just what works today may not work tomorrow, but it might work the next day. Or the following day. So it's important to just kind of be to persevere and be persistent with things, and really try not to give up on that individual. And like I said, trying things, multiple times, not just trying it once or twice, like, oh, that didn't work. Well, let's look at it again, and keep trying. Mild can be a misnomer. So we've talked about mild, moderate, severe, and how mild brain injury or concussion is hard to gauge because people don't often go in and people don't often lose consciousness. But if we have multiple mild injuries, that can compound into a more severe effect. Okay, so just because we see that an individual has a mild injury, especially if they have multiple mild, that can be a recipe for disaster. And once we've had one brain injury, we've cracked that foundation of the brain. And so now we're much more susceptible to another injury. And so once we've had one, we can, we're 3 times more likely to have another. Once we've had another, we're 8 times more likely, like it just builds and builds. I've met people that have, reported as many as 27 concussions throughout their lifetime because they cracked that foundation, and they're, just have lots of reasons why: falls, domestic violence, car accidents, multiple reasons, but those can really have compounding effects. So when we look at this list, there are 3 main areas that we have impairments after brain injury: physical, cognitive, and emotional and behavioral. And a lot of people, I think, when they see this slide, they're like, oh, well, just basically we all have brain injury, right? So all of these are very general, or so to speak, and there's a lot of them, because again, we go back to that idea of, brain injuries are like snowflakes, and they're all very different, and we were all very different before. So oftentimes we don't completely change after brain injury. A lot of the things that we struggled with before, we're still going to struggle with. That's not going to magically go away. But I would say, to generalize a little bit, under physical, we hear a lot of things about headaches, changes in sleep. That fatigue factor can be really detrimental to someone with brain injury. They really need to kind of focus on sleep and focus on healing. So many times we want to get back to work, or back to our normal life, but we might need some time to do that, and it might not look the same as it did before the injury. Cognitive. So cognitive refers to basically our thinking, how our brain works, to interpreting things, to it coming out. And a lot of times memory is impaired, particularly short-term memory after brain injury. A lot of times our judgment is impaired. We are unable to complete tasks without reminders. Just a lot of organizational problems. The one thing, though, I always like to make sure clients are aware of is that your IQ does not change after brain injury. If it does, it's maybe by just a few points. So it's not that they can't learn, it's that it's impaired. And so we need to find a way that they can learn, a way that to present information in a way that makes sense to that individual, in a way that is appropriate for them. And then we have emotional and behavioral. This is usually the scary part for the people that love this person, that knew this person prior to injury. Oftentimes you see depression and mood swings, some inappropriate behaviors, inability to inhibit social remarks. I always say, if you want to truly know how you look one day, ask someone with a brain injury, and they'll for sure tell you. But really, the saddest part for me personally with my clients is that difficulty maintaining or reforming relationships. And a lot of that, I think, goes back to the cognition, and far as the impaired processing speed. People with brain injury often can't keep up with like our normal, typical conversation pace and things like that. And so they just really struggle socially, and it can be very hard for them. So I mentioned fatigue as an area that a lot of people struggle with, and that it's a bummer, because basically fatigue has 2 main spots for someone with brain injury. There's primary fatigue, which is actually the arousal mechanism in the brain has been impacted. The brain is what wakes us up, what gets us going and moving and paying attention to things and all of that. And so oftentimes, Rebecca will say, they need their top spun. Someone with a brain injury needs their top spun. They need someone or something to, get them up, get them going, get them started on tasks, and get them switching over to tasks so they don't stay on something for too long. And then secondary fatigue are factors, that exasperate that fatigue. So I talked earlier about anxiety, kind of being a common factor after brain injury. And so when we're anxious, that wears on our body. When we're depressed, when we can't sleep well, when we have stress and we have pain. So it's just all those contributing factors. So basically it's kind of a double whammy, or a combination of primary and secondary fatigue. So you will notice we hear a lot of times, they're lazy, or they're not motivated, or non-compliant, but really they're tired. They need a break. Oftentimes, to combat fatigue, we often recommend brain breaks. And a lot of people will say like, oh, I do fine, and then I just melt at the end of the day. Well, we don't want you to do that. We don't want you to push through. We want you to take breaks, whether your body kind of tells you or not, because it might not always. Especially, I think we find within the Midwest here, we're very proud and we don't want to ask for help, or we, want to be strong and push through things. But it's really important that we give that brain the rest that it needs. And by rest, I mean not necessarily sleeping, but if you're worried you're going to fall asleep, then set an alarm. But 20 minutes with a quiet room, no lights, no sounds, no screens, none of that. Just rest, just true, genuine rest. And then I would do that several times a day to make sure we can combat that fatigue. And so one of an acronym that we really like at the Brain Injury Network is rowboats. It's a long one, but it helps you learn how to present information to someone with a brain injury to accommodate for that information. So the R is for reduce the amount of information. Less said is best said. I love that one. I heard that one recently. Less said is best said. So don't get wordy with someone with a brain injury. You're kind of wasting your voice, wasting your energy. Just the least amount of information as possible. We want to try to give one instruction at a time. Oftentimes, multi-step directions for someone with brain injury are they're going to struggle. We want to provide written and verbal whenever possible. So much of our world is just talking, right? Verbal. When we go to the doctor, when we go to a lecture, anything like that, or a concert, it's all written, all verbal. And so we want to provide written information whenever possible, as well as verbal. So we often recommend people take their after visit summaries. So if they go to the doctor, ask for that after visit summary. Breaks are helpful. So I just talked about brain breaks. So that is what I mean by breaks. So that true, no stimulation, no screens, no lights, nothing. Just quiet breaks several times throughout the day can be really helpful. Often is better. Routines help. When our brain knows what's coming, it does much better. So any kind of routine you can create, waking up at the same time, going to bed around the same time, meals, all of that, kind of the same steps throughout the day can really, really help our brain to know what's coming next. The A in robots is ask the person for a paraphrase or repeat. So this can really gauge comprehension. So are they understanding what you're saying? When you give direction, now you can say, okay, so what did I just ask you to do? That can be a really good judge of, are they with you? Are they understanding you? If not, we might need to talk about it more or longer or in a different way, use different words. We need to take time and go slowly. We definitely can't rush someone with brain injury. That processing speed piece that we saw on the last slide is critical. I often find myself counting inside my head when I'm waiting for a client to respond to something. And I have many clients that I will get to 30, in my own head. And so that is a significant amount of time for those of us that are used to kind of that more fast-paced conversation type thing. So just give them some time, give them some grace, take some breaths and help to yourself if that helps, or find a strategy that works for you. And then we really want to simplify and organize our information. I was just talking to a client recently and I asked about our tip sheets that we will talk about more in our other courses. And she said, they're great, but really we need to dumb them down. And that's how she said it. She said, I know it sounds horrible, but I need you to dumb it down for me. And so, that's her words, not mine. But basically that's, to be honest, bring things down, use as simple language as possible. So rather than saying, do you have any siblings? Just say brother or sister. Sibling is a hard word, things like that. Just really try to bring things down and simplify it. Another acronym, while we're talking about acronyms, I talked before about how not everybody goes to the emergency room, right? Not everybody goes in, and maybe they should have. So a helpful acronym to remember when you have a client you work with, think of helps. So H, did you hit your head? Did you go to the emergency room? Or like I said, maybe you didn't go, but maybe you should have went. Did you have an L, a loss of consciousness or an altered mental state? Did you have problems after in your daily life? And did you experience significant sickness? Usually for a while after, or is there days where you just can't even function, can't get out of bed, that kind of thing. So that helps is a really helpful acronym. It's also a screening that is provided as well, but it's not as research-based and as evidence-based as the screening that the Brain Injury Network decided to use. And so this is the screening that we use for brain injury here. This is the OSU TBI ID. And so literally it's these 4 questions. It's very simple, but this does not replace a formal diagnosis from a doctor. This is simply saying you need to further investigate this, loss of this hit to the head, or this, whatever might be going on inside your body. So literally you want to read word for word questions 1 through 4. We can't just simply ask people, have you had a brain injury? That's just not how we talk. It's not common language, right? We don't usually talk like that. And doctors don't even always say it that way either. They might say, oh, you have edema, which we can look over here and we see that swelling of the brain. Whoops, I'm sorry. But that can also lead to, injury. And so basically we're asking questions 1 through 4. And if anyone says yes to any of these questions, then they screen positive. Okay, so this is a brain injury screening that we use at the network. We have a very cool password protected area on our website with a data entry portal. If you or someone you work with, you would like to screen or you want more information on screening, that would be a separate training that we can provide you, and we would give you access to that portal area and explain all of this to you much more in depth. But this is just kind of a plug for that, and to keep this on your radar, because many brain injuries go unidentified. That's kind of one of the leading causes of, vocational and social failure, basically, is brain injury. And so if we can help identify more people and give them a reason why their behavior is that the way it is, it can really help explain a lot of things for individuals that kind of maybe have had a constant struggle with life in general. So yes, again, we cannot just ask if someone has had a brain injury. So these tools were designed to help individuals recall information they may have forgotten. Like I said earlier, a lot of people have had a brain injury, but they don't realize it at the time, how significant it was, or they feel better after a few days or a few weeks. And so they kind of forget about it. But then when those demands get higher for them, or oftentimes when the aging process happens. So as we age as well, and the higher demands get placed on our brain and it's trying to keep up, it doesn't always do the best job. So, and then we want to think about those high risk populations, those homelessness, criminal justice, all of those risk areas. As far as having high risk for brain injury, those areas should be screened as well. Okay. So we want to screen because it can lead to awareness. It can lead to self-advocacy with brain injury, like that rowboats. Those accommodations we can make are very simple and easy to make, and they really don't take a lot of time, a lot of energy. You don't really need a lot of fancy tools or anything like that. And so really teaching someone, oh, the lights in here are bright, can I wear a baseball cap? To be able to ask something like that, it's very simple, but sometimes it takes explicitly explaining it to them and teaching it before individuals can learn it. And then another, why to screen as well. There could be more effective treatment. I've met people at the Brain Injury Network that, had concussion years ago and they're still struggling with their vision. Well, concussion should heal itself within 4 to 6 weeks. So if that hasn't happened, then you need to call us. We need to find more effective treatment options. We need to get you into probably an ophthalmologist and look at your vision more thoroughly than we would with just like an optometrist. So that is our role, though. That is the Brain Injury Network's role. We wouldn't expect you guys to remember all that information, and that is why you call us and you call Nikki and we try to get things figured out as to why you're still having symptoms and try to give you some relief from those. And then screening is easy. You saw that screen yourself. It's really, like I said, those 4 basic questions that takes about 10 minutes to implement. And just really gives us a better idea of a better explanation as to what could be going on within our body. So these are kind of the things that would lead to a positive screen. So an event that could have caused a brain injury. So falls, motorcycle accidents, domestic violence. There's so many things that it could be, strokes, tumors, all that kind of stuff. So anything that could have caused brain injury. A period of altered consciousness following that event. So people might have had bumps and blows, but they didn't have that whole feeling goofy or feeling dazed or confused. So not everybody that's ever hit their head has a brain injury, but if they have that altered consciousness as well as a hit to the head, that's an indicator that they probably did. And then typically there's 2 or more problems with their daily life after the event. So they might struggle now with organizing, they might struggle socially, they might struggle with sleep. There's usually a combination of problems. It's usually not just one area, there's usually 2 or more, oftentimes more areas that individual struggles with. So as we wrap up here, again, as I've said, brain injury is a chronic condition. There are many treatments available out there to have, but it can be a confusing process because you learn about all those lobes and all that stuff that it's responsible for that the brain does. So there can be many, many specialists, many areas of things that we need to look at, treatment options and things. And so that's really NDBIN's role, is to help you navigate that process. So give us a call, send us a referral, and let us know, and we can try to help navigate that process. Our services are always free. There's never a charge for us, so clients don't ever need to worry about that either. But yeah, if you're working with a client and you're struggling or they're struggling, just please reach out and refer and let us know. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you back for cognitive and behavioral consequences. Thanks.